Well, rather than focus on me, let me outline the events and how a group of us working together were catalysts in a series of transactions which I think ultimately resulted in the collapse of the Soviet bloc and perhaps the most important single political event of our times. My involvement began in the spring of 1987. And during that period, two people. One was Liz Wasiutyńską, who was the American representative of Solidarity. And the second was Jerzym Milewskim, who was the international representative of Solidarity out of Brussels. Milewski was subsequently to become the Secretary of State of Poland and also the Deputy Defense Minister of Poland. But Wasiutyńską and Milewskim came into a meeting of the foreign policy, military defense policy group of the conservative movement. It was called the Stanton Group. And Milewskim and Wasiutyńską came into that meeting and made a presentation on behalf of Solidarity. I suspect conservatives weren't the first people they thought of coming to, but a man named Jim Boulay, who used to had English first and was at that time working for the moral majority, said that they should come and speak to conservatives, and so they did. And their message was basically that Solidarity was cash-starved. It had, in 1979, 1980, had all the attention of the world focused on it. But after the brutal and repressive imprisonment and even execution of Solidarity leaders during that period, I think the thinking in Washington was that Solidarity was pretty much a spent force as of spring of 1987. And so, and certainly the feeling, I think, in the Reagan administration State Department. And so they were beginning to develop this doctrine that operated on the premise that, well, if we take repressive regimes like Jaruzelski and Ceausescu and Gorbachev, and I guess Zhou Enlai was head of China at that point, and began providing them assistance and trade and began building up the economies of these communist governments, then eventually, although they'll remain communists, they will, as they become more affluent, become less repressive. And I think that was the State Department doctrine which was emerging at that time, and that's still the State Department doctrine with respect to China to this day. I had come from a slightly different perspective. A few years earlier, I had drafted the Sims Amendment, also for Senator Steve Sims, who was the chief sponsor of the Solidarity funding legislation. And my amendment would have kept the Reagan administration from pulling out of its assistance to the Afghan resistance. The situation was in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen were fighting against the Soviets in a very brave and ultimately successful battle for the future of that country. And the Reagan administration was becoming, we were told, sick and tired of that unending war and was about to withdraw assistance from the Mujahideen. I drafted the Sims Amendment, which basically pushed the Reagan administration to continue becoming engaged on behalf of the Afghani resistance. It turned out to be pretty successful. Ultimately, the Mujahideen defeated the Soviets and drove them out of the country, and that was probably the first major example of the Soviet Union being defeated and expelled from what was viewed as a part of the Soviet bloc. So when Wasiutyńską and Milewskim came in and asked for money for Solidarity, my first reaction was that Solidarity could perform the same sort of function as a catalyst against the Soviet Union that the Mujahideen had performed in Afghanistan. At least someone in the room said to me, Mike, will you get Solidarity the money? And I said, okay, fine. So we walked out into the hall outside the meeting room, and I had two questions. First of all, how much money would it take for Solidarity to be made whole and to be made functional and to do everything it needed to do? And my second question was, would it bother you if the money were provided in an explicit grant of funds from the United States Congress? The answer to the second question was, no, we would like that. We'd like getting a check signed by the United States Congress. The first question, the answer surprised me. Milewski said, well, okay, what about $1 million? There's a fairly famous film in America starring Mike Myers as Dr. Evil. He's a guy who basically woke up after a generation of in a time warp, and he was trying to basically extort the U.S. government of money in exchange for not destroying the world. And they asked him how much money he wanted, and he said, $1 million. And then someone leaned over his shoulder and told him that $1 million wasn't worth very much in the last half of the 20th century. And he corrected himself and he said, $1 billion. And that was my reaction, that $1 million is chump change in Washington, and it was just extraordinary that Solidarity could be revitalized with this small an amount of money. But in fact, it turned out, from figures I saw more recently, it doubled Solidarity's overseas budget and allowed it to do things that it hadn't been able to do before. So I drafted legislation sponsored by Senator Steve Sims of Idaho and Senator Alan Dixon of Illinois, and Liz Wasiutyńska and I began working on getting co-sponsors for the legislation. And ultimately, we got 20 senators, that is 20% of the Senate, to co-sponsor legislation saying we're giving Solidarity $1 million a year for the foreseeable future. And we worked very, very carefully to make sure that for every conservative Republican, there was a liberal Democrat. Well, it was very difficult. It's always difficult crafting a bipartisan coalition. I think that there was, particularly on the left, a general good feeling with respect to Solidarity, although I don't think the most activist liberal congressman ever thought that Solidarity would be revived and would be the instrumentality, the catalyst for the collapse of communism in the world. But so there was this good feeling we could work on the left, and Liz Wasiutyńska also had contacts with a lot of the liberal Democrats in the Senate. I had enough strength by force of my position as General Counsel of the Senate Steering Committee to deliver a conservative Republican for every liberal Democrat that Liz was able to get. So in the end, we had a completely bipartisan bill with 10 conservative Republicans by and large, and 10 very liberal Democrats and very few people in the center, which might strike people as surprising if they didn't know the etymology of the whole exercise. There are two types of legislation in Washington. One is policy bills called authorization bills, and the second is money bills called appropriations bills. And we knew that this policy bill, although it was a mechanism for a bunch of senators to show they supported the concept, we knew it wasn't going anywhere. That wasn't going to be the vehicle, the legislative vehicle that gave Solidarity its money. So it turned out, to our great surprise, that a couple months later, there was an emergency money bill called a Urgent Supplemental Appropriations, which was zooming through Congress to provide emergency military assistance. I think it's for the war in Iraq and some other purposes. But all of a sudden, we had, a lot sooner than we thought we were going to have it, we had a vehicle to attach our funding for Solidarity to. And so at that time, I had to go into a man who was pretty instrumental, I think, in getting funding for Solidarity, and his name was Bond, James Bond. And he was the chief Republican staffer for the Appropriations Foreign Ops Subcommittee. He was the one who determined exactly, from a Republican standpoint, how the money was distributed among all of the foreign aid programs of the federal government. And he was, if you've ever seen the Superman movie, he was Perry White. He was chomping a cigar all the time, which is normally pretty wet and never lit. And he was gruff, and he was, what do you want? But if you got James Bond to go along with you, you got your money. And lo and behold, I went into him, and he said, okay, you got your $1 million. And so, beginning in the summer of 1987, we provided Solidarity with the first of $3 million we appropriated to it. And in addition, we provided money a few months later for what was called fiscal year 1988, but 1988, and we provided money for 1989. The first $1 million they spent on ambulances. And I could always tell when Jerzym Milewskim came from Brussels into town with bad news for me, we would always go downtown to a little restaurant called Anna Maria's on Connecticut Avenue. It was a very, very old institution in Washington. It was considerably past its prime, but it has photos all over the wall of all the famous people, Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby, and all the famous people who had eaten there. And for Jerzy, it very much embodied the American concept of prestige and glamour. So, but whenever he had bad news for me, we'd always go to Anna Maria's. And I remember the first piece of really bad news is, oh, we're going to use your first $1 million not for to overthrow the communist government, but to purchase ambulances as a publicity stunt. And so, it's God in his great wisdom sometimes works in mysterious ways, and this was one of the more mysterious ways. But subsequent years, Solidarity used it for organizing, and I like to think for organizing the strikes, which ultimately led to the overthrow of their government. The view of most of Washington at that point was that resistance in Eastern Europe was a spent force. We'd seen the Hungarian Rebellion crushed. We'd seen Prague Spring crushed. We'd seen Solidarity crushed. Its leaders imprisoned and tortured and, in some cases, executed. And I think there was a lot of excitement on behalf of Solidarity in 1980. I think in 1987, the view in the Reagan State Department and throughout most of the world was that the Soviet bloc was going to remain intact for until the end of eternity, and that the only thing we could do is try to give foreign aid to people like Jaruzelski in order to make them a little more humane. My experience from defeating the Soviets in Afghanistan was a little different. My intention from the very beginning was that Solidarity be a catalyst for the destruction of the Soviet bloc. And I specifically quoted by Izvestia as saying, we view Solidarity as our Contras in Eastern Europe. I think Izvestia, there's a phrase in the Soviet Union that is a play off of the title of the newspaper Izvestia, which is the news, and the title of the newspaper Pravda, which is literally the truth. And the phrase is, in Izvestia there is no news, in Pravda there is no truth. And so I was quoted in Izvestia as saying, yeah, we intend to use Solidarity in order to destroy world communism. The State Department wasn't very happy about that. I doubt if the CIA was very happy about it either. And I don't think it was in line with their plans. Furthermore, I talked about sitting down with Jerzym Milewskim, who was to become the Secretary of State of Poland, in a little restaurant on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, and I would say how basically Solidarity needs to rise up and begin resisting the communist regime again. And even Jerzy would say, well, the Soviets have all these troops in Poland, and more importantly, all these tanks in Poland, so there's probably never going to come a time in which we're going to successfully do that. I think even in Solidarity, there was a notion, and certainly there were factions of Solidarity, just as there were factions of the United States government. And there were some who were very confrontational, and most of the ones that were aligned with me, and there were some which were felt that we should, that Solidarity should work to a greater extent with the Jaruzelski regime. And but I think the thinking was, at least in some of Solidarity, that the country would always be communist, and the issue was simply making it a little more humane than it had been. That was, to my knowledge, no one else in Washington other than me was saying, well, if we can get Solidarity to rise up against the Polish government, if we can make that successful against all odds, then guess what? The rest of the Soviet Empire is going to fall just like dominoes. Lo and behold, my plan was the one which actually faced realization, and everyone else's scenario just crumbled. Not, I think, as a result of any wisdom on my part, but God's good timing and God's ability to do things which most of us would view as impossible. Organization as complex as the U.S. government. This is an organization as complex as the State Department. There are various factions battling each other for supremacy, and there are people who bragged, certainly after it became clear that Solidarity was the catalyst for the turn of history. There are people who bragged, I was the pro-Solidarity guy in the State Department, and this guy was the anti-Solidarity guy. We do know that the State Department, as a general proposition, was lobbying Congress not to give Solidarity the money at the time. The authorizations and appropriations were passed, and in particular, the State Department and was particularly strong with Jesse Helms, who was at the time, I think, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so we had Helms agree to the State Department's demand that he strike the name of Solidarity from any authorizations of money going to democracy movements in Poland, which was contrary to what Solidarity wanted. On the other hand, we had the Appropriations Committee, basically led by James Bond, basically loyal to Solidarity and fighting to keep Solidarity in their version of the legislation. So guess what? If a choice comes between a policy bill, which doesn't give out any money, that omits the name of Solidarity, and a money bill, which specifically mentions Solidarity, it's the money bill that prevails. And so Bond and I prevailed over Helms and the Foreign Relations Committee in terms of ensuring that particularly the last tranche for fiscal 89 went directly from Solidarity and couldn't be diverted by the State Department to other sources. Now, we were told, I was told almost from the beginning, almost from the spring of 1987 by Milewskim and Wasiutyńską, that the Reagan administration had a directive in place which was sending a limited amount of money to Solidarity, probably about $300,000 or a little less than $300,000 a year, and that had been going on since the beginning of the Reagan administration. So that's not chump change. Over 8 years, $2.4 million. But on a continuing basis, as Solidarity continued at that level of funding, I think it would have remained a stagnant and insignificant force in Poland. Milewski and Wasiutyńską came to Washington to specifically complain to us that the amount of money the U.S. government was giving them, while not unappreciated, was essentially chump change compared to what they would need to become the sort of vigorous movement which would make a difference in Poland. I think the State Department didn't, by that point, had determined that their play was to try to build better relations with Jaruzelski, which was the reason why they were giving $42 million to him. And I think they, in some cases, although viewed Solidarity as an irritant. I should say that the U.S. government, I think, certainly the Poles in 1988, given their sort of monolithic communist government, perhaps overestimated the extent to which the U.S. government spoke with one voice. There were various factions battling for this position and that position, and within the administration and within the State Department there were people who were viewed as pro-Solidarity and people who were viewed as pro-Jaruzelski, and they were constantly battling one another for primacy. And so in the end, I probably shouldn't say this, but the Solidarity, when it wanted to communicate with the outside, would put the message in an envelope or something and throw it through the embassy gates in Warsaw. And that's the way they communicated with the United States. And they didn't realize it, but the CIA in Warsaw had the capacity, and in fact did, photograph the copies of those envelopes, the copies of the letters inside those envelopes, without even taking the letters out of the envelopes. So the CIA had basically photographed a letter from Lech Wałęsa to Lane Kirkland, who was the head of the AFL-CIO, and basically the letter said, in taking the Sims-Dixon money, we have to be very, very careful on the PR with respect to this. But the State Department was, while classifying the contents of that letter, peddling it around the hill for the proposition Solidarity doesn't want the money. Don't give them the money, they didn't want it. And so we had to, at various points in the process, battle the Reagan administration, and specifically battle people in the State Department who were using classified information to try to persuade Congress not to give Solidarity any more money behind our backs. And that was, it was always a challenge. It was a challenge fighting the people who liked Solidarity so much, or at least considered it so much their proprietary possession, that they insisted that the money go through them. And it was a challenge because of people who didn't want the money to go to Solidarity at all. So it looks at this stage of the game, it looks like halcyon bipartisanship, certainly compared to the second year of the Donald Trump administration. And compared to the second year of the Donald Trump administration, it certainly was halcyon bipartisanship. But that didn't mean there weren't constant struggles between those who didn't want to aid Solidarity, those who wanted to aid Solidarity but wanted their cut, and those who wanted to just hand over the money to Solidarity as quickly as possible. And those struggles were constant and ongoing. I think it was God's good timing. I certainly, it's certainly the fact that the money came to Solidarity just in time for it to use it in order to precipitate events that overturned the greatest empire in the history of the world didn't come from my wisdom in any sense. I think that after the state of emergency in '80, Solidarity was pretty much dispirited, and it did take a time for our funding to begin to build it up to the point in which it was ready to strike and ready to run the risk that it was going to have a repeat of the state of emergency from a decade earlier. So yeah, there was timing in a sense that was at work here, and I think it's probably Solidarity's good timing as much as anyone else's. It certainly wasn't as a result of any planning from me. As to what was going on within Solidarity, I probably didn't know as much about that as Milewski or Wasiutyńską or others. Our understanding is that there were two factions in Solidarity at the time. One was aligned with Warsaw and with the American embassy there. Amazingly, it was the squishier of the two factions. One was aligned with Milewski and Wasiutyńską and Malik in Poland and was the hard line of the factions. I had been told that the Warsaw faction and Malik went before Wałęsa over the question of whether Solidarity was going to accept any money from the outside at all. And understand that if Solidarity didn't accept our money, then it would continue to limp along at the pace it had limped along since about 1980. Perhaps being able to be sustained, but perhaps not being able to be sustained. So what I was told is that, I think it's Gremick and Malik went before Wałęsa to argue the question of whether they should reject the U.S. money. And Wałęsa sort of responded after he'd heard the two cases by laughing and saying, "Of course we'll accept the money," which would seem to be a logical conclusion, but you never know. We also knew that, at least initially in '87, there was a lot of sort of dispirited emotion in Poland among the people in Solidarity. I think many of them had bought on to the notion that, Eastern Europe would forever remain a firm communist bloc under Soviet domination, and I think many of them believed that. Toward the one of the things Milewski told me was toward the end of, I think, 87 or beginning of 88, the Pope held a mass for Solidarity, and the sort of morbid humor in Poland was that it was a funeral mass. And what Milewski said to me is that there's some thinking in Poland that perhaps Solidarity should not be an organization anymore, but begin to become, and he used a Polish word, and I wish I could remember it, and Liz Wasiutyńska was there, and she doesn't remember it, but he said it should stop being a formal organization and begin becoming a spirit, or a chi, or a charisma, or what, chimera, or whatever. But there was some thinking, there was some discussions to me that people in Poland were actually talking about disbanding Solidarity as an organization. So we knew we were fighting to keep people in Poland from falling into ultimate despair. I think and I hope that by August of '88, when I was there, that they had been sufficiently infused with money and sufficiently infused with hope so that when they struck in Gdansk, there was a genuine expectation that, in fact, there would be some chance that life in Poland, at the very least, would be more humane and more hospitable to freedom and to democratic movements. Liz Wasiutyńska led a delegation of Americans into Poland in August of 1988. And I was sort of the head of the delegation. The delegation was organized, or I guess Liz was head of the delegation. The delegation was organized around the people who had basically co-sponsored and supported the amendment I had drafted to give Solidarity $1 million a year. So we all went in to a conference right outside of Krakow, in a conference at the Great Church of Nowej Hucie, which was sponsored by Solidarity and Peace and Freedom. And I guess a little background about Nowej Hucie, although most people in Poland will know the background. It was supposed to be Stalin's great gift to Poland, along with this giant monstrosity skyscraper in Warsaw. The joke in Warsaw was, you ought to visit the Stalin skyscraper because it's the only place in town where you can get a view which is not obstructed by the city's most notorious eyesore. But Nowej Hucie was the same thing. The whole town was a workers' paradise with happy worker housing and all the other things that a Kafkaesque communist state would have. The one thing it didn't have, as you would expect from a communist town, is a church. And the way the story was related to me, the first day after people began to move in the main square, there was a cross erected, and the communists rapidly took it down and destroyed it. And the second day there was a cross erected. And the third day there was a cross erected, and they'd take it down, but they couldn't stop the new residents from Nowej Hucie for agitating on behalf of their faith. And that led to, I'm told, negotiations with Karol Wojtyła, who was the Bishop of Krakow at that time, and ultimately the construction of this church, the great church at Nowej Hucie. And this was where our conference was held. And I came to realize, in retrospect, that it wasn't a coincidence that at the same time Solidarity and Wałęsa were striking in Gdansk in the north, all of these Americans and Europeans were called into the country in the south. And the reason was, and it took me 20 years to realize the genius of this on behalf of Solidarity, the reason was, when the government declared a state of emergency and began arresting, imprisoning, and executing people, guess who's right in the middle of the country watching all of this? The Americans. And we were going to become one of three things. We were either going to become witnesses to the atrocity, or we were going to become prisoners, or we were going to become corpses. But we had been summoned into Poland to be witnesses to the government's response to the strikes which Solidarity was conducting at the same time, and that wasn't any coincidence at all. So we attended the conference. I made it clear that I was going to speak at the conference, and that in my speech I was going to call for the overthrow of the Polish government. There were three sets of Americans there. There was our delegation. There was Mayor Flynn of Boston, who was very close to the Pope and who subsequently became the emissary to the Vatican. And there was a CIA team. My memory is the CIA team was disguised as a French film crew, which was sort of funny because, unlike most French, they loved to speak English with me, And coming from the Midwest as I do, I sort of know gradations of different types of Midwestern accents. The Kansas City accent, the Iowa accent, the Kansas accent, the Illinois accent. And ironically, this French film crew spoke English with an Iowan accent, which made me come to believe that the little French village they came from was the village of Des Moines. And so, at any rate, the CIA was not very happy about my intentions to call for the overthrow of that government. And Solidarity, in fact, I'm not sure was particularly thrilled either. And as a matter of fact, it had been ironically, my intention to come to that country for the purpose of being arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and martyred. Even more ironically, I was the only one who liked that plan. And so Solidarity immediately jerked me out of the Krakow Intercontinental, where I had checked in for the duration of the conference, and moved me to a safe house, not particularly to my happiness, but to their considerable satisfaction. And I do remember, the one thing I remember about, well, there are two things I remember about that church. The first is that if you walk to the front of the meeting room where the speakers were and went off to the left side, there is a little room where the Solidarity was serving little egg sandwiches, little narrow slices of egg put on little thin slices of bread. And by American standards, it seemed like a fairly modest element of hospitality. But I came to realize that in Poland at that time, that was an extraordinary generosity and represented an extraordinary sacrifice by them to be hospitable to their American and other guests. The second thing I realized is that on the bulletin board was a document in Polish. There's one document on their bulletin board in that room. And it was in Polish, so initially I didn't pay too much attention to it. As the conference went on and I didn't have anything to do sitting there and contemplating not eating my egg sandwich, I came to study it closely. And it became apparent to me that what it looked like was an NED document provided in Polish, and it looked to me like the Constitution of the United States, that element which had inspired Poland lo these many years as Solidarity fought harassment, torture, and imprisonment in order to try to obtain that country's freedom. It was our Constitution, it was our fight for liberty, which had served as an inspiration to them. The second thing that happened to me is I did stray upstairs to the main floor of the sanctuary of the church for a service. And I was standing there where there weren't a whole lot of people in the sanctuary yet. And let me say that I believe in God. I believe that God has spoken to me through various parts of my life, but I have never had an experience like this in which I was literally thrown to my knees. And as I looked up, there was something, is not exactly physical, but it was more than spiritual, that looked as though it were the hand of God moving across the sanctuary, so as to say, I'm about to do something extraordinary, which is going to transform the world. And I've never had an experience before then. I have never had an experience since then like this. But I genuinely believe to this date that God was saying to me that He was about to use the people around me in order to fundamentally transform the world in a way that had not happened in my lifetime and would not happen in my lifetime again. So I gave my speech. I announced that Solidarity was going to get its $3 million. In addition, I read the statement from the Defense Department authorization bill saying, oh, incidentally, if you touch anyone from Solidarity, we're going to take away your $40 million and turn you into a pariah state. And finally, I ended with a pretty thinly veiled call for the overthrow of the government when I said, we look forward to the time when you will stand with us as free men. And the subsequent to that, I think not as a result of my speech, but probably as a result of the strike in Gdansk, which was coordinated with us, the government did declare a state of emergency. We had a little caravan which was going to Auschwitz to pay homage to those people who died in that horrible place. And on the way back, they, pursuant to the state of emergency, they stopped our caravan and they began trying to arrest people. And we got out of our little bus and started rioting. And since there were only a few police, we succeeded in using our mini riot in order to back them off. But ultimately, those strikes, to make a long story short, although I realize it's much, much too late for that now, those strikes led to what were called the round table conferences, in which Solidarity negotiated with the government over the elections to be held the next year in June 1989. The government carefully modulated those talks so that although Solidarity could win seats in the what's called the Sejm, the lower house of the parliament in Poland, it could never take over the government. And so out of those strikes arose that conference, which arose those elections in June of 1989. Solidarity, in fact, and I hope it was with our money, I hope and pray it was with our money, won every seat which it was legally authorized to compete for. And then it did something that the government didn't expect. It formed a little coalition with a minor farmers' party, which gave it control of the Sejm. In June 1989, the Poles took over, the Solidarity took over the Polish parliament. Shortly thereafter, Jaruzelski, seeing the writing on the wall, resigned, and the communist government of Poland had fallen without firing a shot. Now, what arose from that? The answer is that within a month or two, the Hungarians overthrew their government. Shortly thereafter, the Czechoslovakians overthrew their government. And they opened the border to East Germany. So East Germans began pouring out of the country through the porous border into Czechoslovakia. As a result of that, basically in November of 1989, with the East Germans pouring out of the country in large numbers, as a result of perhaps a happenstance event, the Berlin Wall fell. The communist government of Bulgaria fell, and in December the 10th and 11th in Romania, and remember this is a half a year from the fall of communism in Poland. Literally within a half a year, the entire Eastern European Soviet bloc had collapsed in its entirety. It was all gone, and it was gone 6 months from the collapse of communism in Poland. Solidarity were the ones which precipitated the biggest transitional event in human history, which toppled the largest empire in human history. So who am I to second guess? I think it's John Kennedy who said, success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. In 1987, Solidarity didn't have many friends at all. In 2018, everyone in the universe was Solidarity's best friend from the beginning.
thank you. Thank,
100 lat, niech żyje, żyje nam. 100 lat, 100 lat, niech żyje, żyje nam. Jeszcze raz, niech żyje, żyje nam. Niech żyje nam.
your cross. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. You are the real heroes. You stood up to Gorbachev and destroyed the biggest empire in the history of the world. So thank you and my tribute to you.
Dobrze, proszę Państwa, ja myślę tak, zanim się zaczniemy cieszyć swoim towarzystwem, co nie jest takie łatwe do zrobienia, bo rzadko się w takim gronie spotykamy, to ja chciałbym może wspomnieć tych, których nie ma wśród nas. Bo trochę tych weteranów nam ubyło. Oczywiście moja ułomna pamięć nie wszystkich wymieni, no bo to jest niemożliwe i to będzie niesprawiedliwe. Ale trochę ich jest, no więc pani Maria Wszelaczyńska, pani Maria Koszarska, mama Hani, pani Bielecka, pani Bielecka, mama Krzysia Bieleckiego.
Włodek Martin.
Włodek Martin będzie na końcu.
Maciej.
Ania Walentynowicz, Alinka Pieńkowska, Ewa Piwowar, Eulalia Kotarska, Stasiu Kotarski, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, Bronek Geremek, Jasiu Liteński, Henio Wujec, Gienek Szumiejko, Tadeusz Jedynak, Aram Rybicki, Leszek Kaczyński.
Piotrek Bednarz.
Tak, proszę Bednarz. Jacek Kuroń, właśnie brawo. Macieja Mijatkowskiego żeśmy wymienili. Jacek Gajek, Tadeusz Sukowski, Włodek Martin już był wymieniony. Jacek Gajek wspomniałem. Maciej Miatkowski już był wspomniany. No i wszystkich, których już nie pamiętam. Waldek Leczkowski. Jerzy Milewski, Janek Majewski. Krótko mówiąc, należy im się wszystkim i których nie pamiętamy. Chwila naszej wdzięcznej pamięci. No a teraz możemy się cieszyć obecnością naszego gościa, który przyjechał tutaj nie dla nas, tylko przyjechał na Ukrainę. Michael Hammond właśnie przez przypadek, że był na tej Ukrainie, jest człowiekiem dla nas wyjątkowym, dlatego bo nie samodzielnie, a w tandemie z Elą Wasiutyńską, tych dwoje Amerykanów, zrobiono na nas rzecz wyjątkową, bo doprowadziło do tego, że Kongres amerykański, czyli Parlament amerykański, zdecydował, że kropelka ich budżetu, symboliczne $1 milion, zostanie przekazany dla Związku Zawodowego Solidarność w Polsce. Po amerykańsku są to pieniądze kolczykowane, to znaczy to są pieniądze, których nikt nie może tknąć, one są przeznaczone dla Solidarności i tyle. I były dla nas. W Solidarności wywołało to niesłychany spór. Ja byłem stroną tego sporu. Po drugiej stronie symbolicznie Bronek Geremek. Mieliśmy całkowicie przeciwne zdanie. Zadecydować musiał nasz przewodniczący Wałęsa, co z tymi pieniędzmi zrobić i ostatecznie decyzja została podjęta, że te pieniądze nie możemy ich zaakceptować. Dostanie Kościół w Polsce na cele pomocy rolnictwu i tak dalej. To jest, ja się czuję wyróżniony, że kopię tego, to jest ustawa, an act. W mojej opinii jest Hammond Wasiutyński Act, czyli ustawa Hammonda Wasiutyńskiej. I ponieważ ja jestem bardzo tym uhonorowane, że akurat...
This is my language verbatim.
Ale język ustawodawczy, który stworzył.
Tak, to znaczy to napisał tymi rękoma
Tak,
Michael.
jest autorem tej ustawy.
Ponieważ ja dostałem od Michaela taki prezent, więc my dajemy Michaelowi taki prezent.
Thank you.
It's in English.
To make it easier.
Well, thank you.
sobie kampanię wyborczą i są bardzo
About my country than about your country. The right thing.
Powiedział bardzo ważną rzecz, że jeśli jesteś przeciwko Bidenowi,
Took the Republican amendment and introduced it himself. There was
Spotykaliśmy się z panem przewodniczącym, czyli z późniejszym prezydentem, 4-krotnie. Pierwsze spotkanie było w naszym mieszkaniu, a drugie spotkanie to było spotkanie noblowskie. W takim miejscu bardzo ustronnym w Borach Tucholskich w Grabowcu. I na tę okoliczność moja teściowa zrobiła tort specjalny, bo to jest przedwojenny przepis. I Gienek Szumiejko, którego już nie ma z nami, ozdobił ten tort jedną świeczką. Jeden Nobel, jedna świeczka. Będzie następny Nobel, będą 2 świeczki. Na razie i to jest ta świeca. To jest ta świeca, która została złożona dzisiaj na specjalną okoliczność. Dla Ciebie przygotowaliśmy kopię tego, co było w 1983 roku.
To commemorate this celebration like which was
I w czasie tego spotkania dla uhonorowania jakby i pana przewodniczącego i upamiętnienia tego spotkania Lech Wałęsa wtedy był przewodniczący, nie był jeszcze prezydentem. Ale nie mieliśmy wątpliwości, że będzie. Posadzony został dom Lech. Uczestnicy tego spotkania podpisali się. I pierwszy kawałek, proszę ukroj.
First piece of cake.
W każdym razie panu przewodniczącemu, późniejszemu prezydentowi bardzo ten tort smakował.
Straty Ukrainy są nieznane, nie? Ale Spotykaliśmy się, to byłem moim promotorem, ale spotykaliśmy się sobie na innym gruncie i powiedziałem, że byłem na wystawie, a tak, to...
Teściową 94, matkę 93, wnuczkę 2.
Sama płaszczyzna taka, wiesz, nic nie daje,
And I hope that the United States will
Przed nami czas przekazania tej Solidarności, z którą my się spotkaliśmy, Solidarności dalej na wschód do Ukrainy. Jest taki wiersz wieszcza ukraińskiego Tarasa Szewczenki sprzed 150 lat do Lachów, do Polaków. I on tam mówi słowy takimi: podaj rękę kozakowi. No i ten czas podania przez Lachów ręki kozakowi, a kozacy inaczej, Ukraińcy obecni są, jakich głosi hymn narodowy, kozackiego rodu. I ten czas właśnie nastąpił. Ja chciałbym podziękować Michaelowi za to, że podjął trud przebycia półświata i przebycia 1000 kilometrów przez ostatni tydzień po Ukrainie, towarzysząc naszemu wyjazdowi z pomocą humanitarną. Michael miał możliwość dotknięcia Ukrainy w tych zachodnich obwodach, bo byliśmy w obwodzie lwowskim, iwano-frankowskim, czernichowskim, częściowo chmielnickim i tarnopolskim. No i widzieliśmy, wydaje się, normalny kraj, normalnie funkcjonujący. Ale wszyscy wiedzą, że to jest kraj objęty wojną. Michael czujnie śpi i dwukrotnie budziły go alarmy nocą, alarmy lotnicze, powietrzne.
A ty spałeś jak
Tak, my spaliśmy i rano dowiadywaliśmy się od Michaela, że był alarm. Później czytaliśmy w prasie polskiej faktycznie. Natomiast no, zetknęliśmy się z wojną w sposób najbardziej brutalny. Widzieliśmy pogrzeby żołnierzy, będąc w Lwowie, kiedy chowano 2 żołnierzy, ale też byliśmy na nowo otwartym cmentarzu, gdzie chowa się od roku żołnierzy ukraińskich w Lwowie. Ten cmentarz liczy już ponad 500 grobów. W większości to młodzi ludzie, około 20 lat. Michaela najbardziej chyba oprócz tych wydarzeń tragicznych poruszyła obecność w szpitalu rehabilitacyjnym w Truskawcu, gdzie dostarczyliśmy pomoc i spotkaliśmy żołnierzy po amputacjach kończyn, nóg, rąk, ćwiczą tam z protezami i tutaj Michael zadeklarował szczególne zainteresowanie. Ja chciałbym podziękować Michaelowi za ten tydzień, za naprawdę ciężki jego wysiłek fizyczny i za tę wolę znowu po 30 paru latach pomocy, tym razem naszemu sąsiadowi wschodniemu. I przekazać mu na pamiątkę ten plakat, który nam towarzyszył w czasie tej wyprawy. Plakat, który symbolizuje wspólne polsko-amerykańskie dbanie o okazanie solidarności Ukrainie, jako państwu, jako narodowi. Michael, for you. Dziękuję.
Long live Solidarność. Long live Ukraine. Long live freedom. Recognizing each of them, they huddled and they came back and said, we want you to delete all of our names.
Teraz byliśmy w tym sanatorium dla żołnierzy po amputacjach w Truskawcu.
Jest absolutnie zupełnie co innego niż jak tam robi taki kryom. Miejscowi.
Teraz jedziemy do Lubicza, do
I one są przechowywane na piętrach
No to u nich kości są tylko w tym następnym.
Dlatego, że jesteś kobietą.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Z tego samego powodu.
Dziękuję.
One more thing that I could have said
Nawet
Ja też dziękuję bardzo.
Ja się wam życzę, Jacek niech wykona.